my background, I'm a scientific researcher on the practical side. Historically, 40 odd years ago, I moved into a 150-year-old property, and I was determined to do something good with it. So initially, heat pumps weren't available, but I did everything I could, and the old saying, insulation, 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 you cannot beat it. It is the crux. Eventually, heat pumps became available, and what I would say at this stage is, look at what other people in the world do. Now, there were three choices for me: America, Canada, or Scandinavia. And in actual fact, the person who I got involved with from Eco Heat Pumps, which is no longer in existence because they were so successful they were bought up, produced or imported Scandinavian stuff, a company called Thermia. Now, I can't get one of these now because people have stopped being able to import them. But this unit was extremely good. And what the chap from Eco Heat Pumps taught me was, I said, well, how about ground source? And he said, well, on the area you've got, if you put a ground source in, the drive will rise. And I'm thinking, hang on, why will the drive rise? Because the heat taken from the ground will freeze the ground. On freezing, you expand. So your drive goes up. That's interesting, I thought. And if you think about it, what's the most easily available substance on the planet along, well, even better than water? And that's air. And my unit has actually run at -15. It has a system in it, which I've no doubt Mitsubishi, well, I'm sure they have, because I'm probably going to put in a Mitsubishi unit because it's the only one I can get that I agree with. It's run at -15 and it defrosts itself. If it gets too cold on the unit outside, it clears it. So as it happened at that time, because there wasn't the expertise, I ended up installing a large part of it myself with the engineer. So I learned an awful lot. In the 12+ years that I've run it, basically, although there is a fault with the computerization, which I know about, I'm not saying I can cure it, it's worked perfectly, non-stop, all the time. Hot water, off of radiators, no underfloor heating, but a very well insulated property. And I have really no complaints whatsoever. As I say, what we all have is air, but the other thing that strikes me about the energy system as such, nobody so far has mentioned how you can check what your property is doing. Now, if you use an infrared detector, you can check where you're losing heat. And perhaps that's the first place you should start, because where you're losing heat, you can hopefully do very simple things to cure that. There's a lot of other things that can be done. Nobody's mentioned heat recovery. It's not an expensive system. It's literally today, I've virtually commissioned 2.5 grand's worth of heat recovery unit, which also filters the air and reduces the pollen count, circulates the air, removes moisture, removes smells, all very simple, and keeps the temperature there as well. Obviously, in this new build, I've gone for underfloor heating. It's important. But the other interesting thing is that with my heat pump system, which, as I say, it was relative, we learned a lot, and I wouldn't do quite the same next time. I would prefer to have the same company. But what it does do, it doesn't have a thermostat in the house. And this is another interesting concept. It works on the outside temperature, and until that temperature reaches a certain level, it won't click in. Now, I prefer to live in a house that's slightly lower temperature, say 19, 20 degrees. And if you like, we're looking also at a lifestyle, because most people want to pump the heat up. Well, if you do in an older property, why not just have a small wood burner? But most people can survive with that, and it's much better for your health as well. So it's a win-win situation. It's interesting how the whole concept is delivered. When I first did this, I used to go to the eco builds, and I was constantly getting people like Worcester Bosch, Mitsubishi asking me about heat pumps. They hadn't a clue. And yet all I did was go abroad and look. And I think we have a lot to learn from other people, amongst lifestyles as well. And also the way we build properties now. My property, fortunately, faces south-southwest, with very few windows on the north and east side. And this is how old houses used to be built. Nowadays, we tend to ignore history. We tend to ignore what's happened before and just innovate with technology. Now, technology does not always work and can so easily break down. So I would say always keep it simple, look very carefully at what you're doing, research it, ask around. Living in an old village, I was always told, if you want to know anything, ask the oldest person in the village. They will give you the answer. And quite often that's the same with regard to the environment, the heating, the building structure, lots of different things. And okay, other people have talked about installers, etc. My experience of installers is shall we say, tenuous. I have a very high level of insulation in my new build, but what I've had, and my son is building it actually, what I have to do is go around and check that they seal every joint. That's not to say the property's airtight, but it stops cold bridging and it stops gaps where you lose heat. And that's why I said earlier, if you go around with an infrared unit and look at any property, especially roofs, you will find a lot of bright spots where people haven't put insulation in properly. And I think there needs to be real control over these people who insulate their properties and do the practical work. It's easy for me to say because I've built houses, I've done all the systems, so I know what I'm looking for. But there needs to be a better control, and keep it simple, move in slow stages and move forward in terms of the community is definitely the case. I have a situation in the village here where I talked to somebody about installing a heat pump, and the installer came along and said, oh no, you can't do that, you can't do that. They can, but you need to know about it, and quite often it's financially driven. I think at that stage it's best if I rest my case. I have a lot of information about all the different things that can happen, and I don't want to run anybody down, but it's a practical situation. You need to do your research, and insulation, insulation, insulation never fails.